Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider, today with Chad Bown, a fellow at the Peterson Institute of Economics in D.C. Previously, he served on Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, and most importantly, alongside Sumaya Keynes, hosts the excellent Trade Talks, a weekly podcast on the economics of international trade policy. Chad, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to discuss the evolving dynamics of the U.S.-China trade war, taking it as a, using the lens of a literal war to go through it. But before we get into that, let me gush just for a second about Trade Talks. It's extraordinarily well thought out, well produced, and just so much better than the average think tank podcast production. So I'm curious if you could walk my listeners through, what's the motivation for doing the show and, how I can learn from you and execute at your level.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction and for the kind words about Trade Talks. I think it's a labor of love that Sumaya and I put together every week. It's a weekly podcast where we try to do a little bit more than just recap the events of that week. We really try to frame it as economists would frame it. So what are the policy questions that are involved? What are the laws that are being used? What are the economic incentives that are taking place? And with the Trump administration in particular, there's just no shortage of material. So I think we've found ourselves quite lucky to have this moment in time. But for us, we use it as a way to try to get a little bit more in depth into what it is that's actually happening. And we're seeing, if you follow social media, Twitter, it's really, really hard to have in-depth conversations about international trade at the moment. And so we kind of use this as a forum to give at least our listeners a chance to hear how economists typically think in greater depth about these particular topical trade issues.
So I remember in college writing a paper about U.S.-Japan trade scuffles in the Reagan administration. And, there was a point where I was like, man, if only I could live in days as exciting as that for trade for trade story. And, here we are 3 months into likely the biggest trade story since, trade conflict since that story. And I'm curious, how you're sort of emotionally taking all of this. On the one level, it's exciting. There are probably more listeners to Trade Talks than there would be. But, a lot of these, a lot of the developments aren't necessarily things that you, personally agree with. So where's your heart at right now?
So for me, this has actually been going on a little bit longer than 3 months. I got lucky in a sense of showing up here at the Peterson Institute essentially right at the moment when it was then candidate Donald Trump was starting to be taken seriously. And so this was April, May of 2016. I showed up here. I had then, at that point in time, been at the World Bank for a number of years, been an academic. But I did my graduate studies on the 1990s. So I had studied, the U.S.-Japan battles. I had studied all of these conflicts, all these laws that the Trump administration has seemingly dusted off. The last time these things were being used was in the 1980s. I had studied these things, but then really hadn't looked at them for 20 years. So I showed up in April of 2016. President Trump gets elected. He starts to do all of these very I don't know the right word, creative things on trade policy. But it was a lot of things that I had seen before and I had studied before. And there's a lot of parallels, to be drawn, I think, out of what we saw, witnessed, learned from the 1980s in particular.
When using this war metaphor to describe what's happened over the past year, my sense, and I'm curious how you think it, is that it's actually more applicable to what we're seeing now than what was going on in the 80s with the U.S. and Japan, because at the end of the day, Japan really relied on the U.S. for its security guarantee, and there was sort of a sense that when push came to shove, we kind of had the upper hand in that regard. So I'm curious whether or not you agree with that point, and to what extent you think the kind of war metaphor really does end up applying to what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I'm happy to use the war metaphor as kind of a literary device to kind of walk us through some of these aspects, but I wouldn't want to take it too far, even in the current context. I think it is less applicable for the 1980s for the reasons you said. For military, geostrategic, political reasons, the United States and Japan have been allies for a very, very long time. And even though in the 1980s there were challenges in the trading relationship, and again, what had happened at that moment in time is you had this very similar to what we see with China, an export-led growth strategy by Japan after the Second World War, its economic development and recovery, moving into areas that placed additional competition on American industries. It started off with clothing and textiles and apparel and footwear, eventually moved into steel, and then automobiles and semiconductors, a lot of the same sorts of industries and trade conflicts that we're seeing today. But the big difference was that Japan was a military ally. And so the United States, in many respects, had this trump card that it could kind of pull out and say that, we really do need for you to stop exporting as much stuff to us, whether it be automobiles or steel or semiconductors. And this is the card they played in the 1980s. And eventually Japan agreed. And part of it was, they were much more reliant on the United States for military reasons in ways that is just very different with China today. Obviously, there's other differences as well, but that's a really, I think, big fundamental geopolitical, geostrategic one.
Well, excuse me for the next 30 minutes while I walk us down this road of using war metaphors as our analytical tool. So first off, I think whenever you look at something like this, you gotta start from the lens of strategy, right? So U.S. trade policy since 1945, at least the way I see it, has been relatively straightforward and reasonably consistent between both parties. Basically, using the power and promise of American investment and access to the largest consumer market to nudge countries towards more open markets and more lower tariffs and more free trade. For the majority of industries. The assumption then being that more trade would help the U.S. and global economy as well as reinforce military alliances. So there definitely seems to be over the past a year and a half of Trump's administration a sort of reimagining of what what the point of trade policy is. So with the globalists now who seem more or less who more or less subscribe to this traditional view on trade, nearly extinguished in the White House. I'm curious if you could sort of articulate maybe the USTR head Robert Lighthizer version of what the point of U.S. trade policy is.
So I think part of the issue is we're still a little bit unsure and a little bit uncertain about what both Ambassador Lighthizer's perspective is, and then a number of other actors as well. I might, though, frame the approach the Americans have taken, since the Second World War, and then how the Trump administration is seeing it differently, slightly differently from the way you have.
Please.
It really was set off a bit earlier than that. So in 1934, we had the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, in which Congress really, for the first time, delegated trade negotiating authority to the president, recognizing before that you had the Smoot-Hawley tariffs and these protectionist pressures that had just led to really high levels of tariffs. And we wanted to move to a system where we were negotiating ways in which we could reduce our own tariffs, but reciprocally opening up trading partners' markets. And what that led to was first the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Trade Organization after that, but essentially the Americans pushing for a rules-based system, and I think that's very important, kind of a market-oriented but rule of law-based system that was based on also non-discrimination, so kind of equal treatment out there, and transparency. And that worked for 70 years or so until the Trump administration came along. And as with a lot of different areas, President Trump has shown a bit of disdain, displeasure, distaste for the rule of law, has shown a willingness to sort of throw that under the bus and to put America first in sort of a bullying type of relationship with various trading partners, withdrawing American leadership in certain respects. So, I mean, those are the major, I think, thematic changes. Whether or not, though, there's an actual grand strategy behind this, I'm not sure. Some of that has to deal with the views toward China and the differing approaches the different people have in the administration toward China and the challenges that China poses. But it's really hard, I think, also to disentangle those types of concerns from other types of concerns, which are or approaches that this president and his team might have, that they're just simply more protectionist and they like tariffs and they're less outward seeking than traditional American presidents and leaders have actually been.
Sure. I mean, it is interesting the kind of the different the different threads you do get. You on the one hand sometimes just feel like Trump kind of enjoys throwing these numbers around, as an executive who can, write on his pen and say he's saving the, jobs in the aluminum industry. But on the other hand, you have Robert Lighthizer giving quotes like, "The way I analyze it, Senator, they have a system and their system is challenging our system, in my opinion." So, sometimes he ends up framing things as actually kind of a defense of that rule-based, reciprocal reciprocal world order, which the U.S. has been pushing towards. So, please.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think so. I mean, it's still too early to really determine, despite the fact that we're now almost 2 years into this administration, if they have a strategy and what it is. But one potential strategy is the one that you just articulated, and is one that I kind of subscribe to. This recognition that at this particular moment in time, at least, was going to be a bit of a reckoning between the United States and China, even if Donald Trump hadn't been elected president. This was a critical moment where it has become clear since China came into the World Trade Organization in 2001 that it hasn't fully transformed itself into being a market economy and a participant in the trading system in the ways that were expected, anticipated, and that poses challenges. The existing rules-based trading system isn't well designed to deal with centrally planned or non-market oriented economies, but non-market also in a way that is very different than, say, the Soviet Union, but the way that China has sort of morphed itself into. So this moment was going to come up. Now, I think this is the big question: is that what the Trump administration is really doing in their trade policy approach? Are they, sort of throwing grenades out there into the system, threatening to blow it up, recognizing that there is this big political moment, this big challenge that the United States and the West, not just the United States, but Europe and Japan and others as well, face, and now confronting this issue of China? And they're trying to fix that. They're trying to remedy it. They're trying to come up with a new system that might work better. Or is there really some other strategy there going on? And I think that's the part a little bit that I'm still unclear about.
Yeah, sure. So later in this conversation, we're going to we're definitely going to sort of compare the ends and the means and see to what extent they do or don't line up as with regards to Trump's strategy on these things. But before we get into that, I'm curious if you feel comfortable summarizing the Xi trade grand strategy. There definitely seems to be an evolution from the Deng Xiaoping era Mandarin lesson now, Tao Guang Yang Hui, which is a Chengyu, hide your talents, bide your time. There's that era definitely has passed, but I'm curious what you think has replaced that.
Well, I think the current international trading system has worked extraordinarily well for China, and China's massively impressive economic development from where it came from 40 years ago, becoming much more market oriented in many respects, being able to open up with the outside world, not only enjoy the benefits of getting non-discriminatory access to export to the United States or Europe or Japan or whomever, but also opening up its own market for imports and welcoming in, foreign direct investment, taking advantage of that to help speed up its economic development. It's an incredibly impressive feat. That being said, China just has not naturally evolved into a Western style economy. And I think that's what, the challenge is. It's done its own thing. It's introduced tremendous amounts of competition, but at the same time, it still has large areas of the economy that are dominated by state-owned enterprises and which can create distortions and can create scenarios where, price signals are less meaningful, certainly relative to outsiders. And so, take the well-known examples of the Chinese commercial banks, right? If they're not lending at essentially market rates, you can effectively subsidize your entire manufacturing sector by giving them access to low-interest loans, or for certain segments of the economy where whether it's energy or other upstream products like the steel industry, where the hot rolled steel, the key input for all the downstream products like pipe or tube or wire, all that kind of stuff is provided by a state-owned enterprise, or a lot of it is provided by a state-owned enterprise that puts downward pressure on prices that ends up looking like a subsidy. Now, these aren't the subsidies that we see in the United States or Europe where it's direct payments by a government to, a company, but it effectively works like a subsidy. But this is just the Chinese system, right? It's just a system that's evolved. And that's, what I think now confronts the world is what to do about that. This evolution of this Chinese system is unlike anything we've seen before, but it presents some conflict with traditional market-oriented economies, and whether or two those can get along and coexist, I think, is really, the big challenge. And now that's what China is confronting as well, I think, is they're being challenged by that. Their system is being challenged by that, and they're going to have to think through what their response is going to be.
So let's now turn to the order of battle. I'm curious if you could walk us through, maybe first with China, since we're on the topic, the sort of strengths and weaknesses as they go into this over the past few months of escalating tariffs.
So on the strength side, I think it's always been clear, at least to me, that China has access to policy instruments that are just not available outside certainly the United States, but a lot of other countries as well. And that goes, well beyond tariffs, but the ability to, have domestic regulations suddenly pop up, inspections suddenly pop up. Now, to be fair, we're starting to see some of that kind of behavior happen in other countries, such as the United States, where traditionally the president wouldn't just be able to threaten and impose tariffs on another country. President Trump has exerted tremendous executive discretion by employing laws like this national security law, this Section 232 law in the United States, or this Section 301 which is behind this China unfair trade case with the intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer, all of those issues. These aren't laws that are traditionally used in the United States, and it's sort of in response to how I think certain people see China as doing business. So that, I think, is the first strength that China has had traditionally. But then when you see how other countries are utilizing it to counteract that, you may say to yourself, maybe that wasn't one of our strengths.
Before we move on from this, we can't forget to mention everyone's favorite, unconventional trade war tool, which hasn't necessarily been brought out, the nationwide boycott. China has repeatedly given during spats with South Korea, with Taiwan, with Japan, helped mobilize the population to not buy cars or pushed tourist groups to visit other countries. This is one of the more interesting cards up their sleeve for sure.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It doesn't seem as if they have started to instigate that with respect to the United States yet. And again, I was in China recently, but it's been a couple of months, so things may be happening. And we'll see. I mean, I think the experience of the THAAD missile system in South Korea really showed how that could be deployed as an effective weapon. And there's a lot of American brands, ways that you can retaliate against American interests that don't involve exports. Now, to do so, however, you have to recognize that some of that could actually be falling into the hands of the Trump administration. One of the Trump administration's big complaints is all of these American companies and multinationals not exporting from the United States, but they're going into China, setting up production facilities in China and producing for China in the Chinese market. If all of a sudden the Chinese government decides to make life difficult for those companies operating in China, that could backfire in the sense that, triggering what ultimately the Trump administration might want, which is to get some of those companies to leave. But yeah, that's one area of strength. On the weakness side, I'm less sure. I think China does have some, challenges in its own domestic economy, with credit, in housing. It certainly has an aging population. But I don't think they're necessarily, would fit into the weaknesses that President Trump thinks are there. President Trump seems to think that because there's this bilateral trade imbalance where the United States imports more from China than China imports from the United States, then that's necessarily going to translate into, China backing down more quickly. And I think, in many respects, it's showing up to be the opposite. In the goods that the Trump administration is imposing higher tariffs on, so far they've picked products that are primarily what are known as intermediate inputs. So these are a lot of the parts and components and gadgets and widgets that go into things that American companies make. Now, the difference, of course, is what China is imposing tariffs over is primarily final goods. They're hitting American agriculture, soybeans and sorghum, pork products. And for a lot of those things, they don't have alternative markets. If they're not going to ship to China, they're perishable. Those farmers are going to lose out. So even though there's an imbalance in terms of the export numbers, the composition of trade in many respects can tend to favor China as well.
So you don't necessarily buy the narrative that an export crunch would really severely threaten the debt markets here, or cause a cascade of traumatic economic events leading. These sorts of worries aren't necessarily, you think, all that legitimate on the Chinese end.
Well, I think they're a bit overblown for a couple of reasons. One is, a number of these products may have alternative markets if they're not going to be sent to the United States. There may be other places in the world that they could be sent. But even beyond that, when you start to look at the products that the United States is imposing tariffs over, a lot of these goods are actually being made by American, European, Japanese multinationals in China and then sent back to the United States. Well, what that means is China's doing a lot of final assembly. It's adding a bit of value, but you're also hurting a lot of your own value added, right? These are the ideas and the research and development and the products that are being developed by American scientists and engineers, with lots of other American parts and components embodied in them that are sent to China and then exported back. So a lot of what the U.S. is imposing tariffs over is actually then feeding back and harming the U.S. economy as well. So I don't buy into this narrative that this is a very, very easy thing to do. I think there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences that economically we're going to only start to realize over time.
So let's now turn to the U.S. side. Maybe first with where you see Trump's strong suits.
Well, I think his strength is how he describes this politically, which does make it seem like it's an easy win for the United States, because he frames this as this bilateral trade imbalance issue, which it really, really is not. But politically for him, he has a lot of people, that his voting base that buys into that narrative. And even though it's not true economically, it's something they think is true, and they're willing to lend support to him for this. He is just an incredibly adept politician, and has that core base of support where, his being seen as being tough and bullying, they seem to like. On the other hand, they also think that he's a deal maker, and so that at the end, these tariffs won't actually come to pass, that he's actually going to make a deal and it's going to be a great deal. But on those points, I'm a little bit more skeptical. I'm not actually sure how it's going to play out. But I guess then the other third thing that comes to mind is there is broader support in the United States, even beyond President Trump and his base right now, that's worry about China. And so there is a bit more latitude to, impose these tariffs to confront China, that if he were doing this, or when he is doing this toward Europe or Canada, there really isn't the same, acceptance there. And part of that is, I think there's increasing concern about China, increasing concern, both from a military geostrategic perspective, but also increasingly from, the American business community that has faced a tougher and tougher time operating in China.
So let me throw out a few weaknesses for you. So the first one being Trump himself. Just in terms of his sort of negotiating style and strategy. The biggest blunder I see so far is the way he handled the ZTE case. So a bit of a summary. Basically, ZTE is a giant Chinese telecom cell phone manufacturer, which violated U.S. sanctions on numerous occasions after repeated warnings by selling U.S. goods, chips, into Iran. But when push came to shoves, it seemed like Trump got a call from Xi saying, help me out here. And he said, sure, fine. It's funny because we heard 8 years of Republicans harping on Obama for being this terrible negotiator who doesn't know how to play his cards right. And even many Democrats getting frustrated with him, particularly when it comes to hanging with the congressional Republicans and John Boehner and the like. But I'm curious if you see, on the one hand, Trump clearly has this talent for framing things in a public sense, but there certainly seem to be questions in terms of actual, leader to leader negotiations, which may have been shooting himself, which he may have already been shooting himself in the foot.
Yeah, on ZTE, I see that episode as showing, I think, weakness of potentially two forms. One was it made all of a sudden political what had previously not ever been really a political area of U.S. law. These sanctions that ZTE was facing had been done not by the sort of political wing of the Commerce Department, but just by the enforcement wing. And President Trump undermined that to a great extent, which then kind of calls into question this issue of any future sanctions. Does the sanctioning country or company need to believe that they're going to face the sanctions, or do they somehow think they'll be able to get out of it? If they're kind of too big to fail, and will that lead to kind of moral hazard problems of them doing things that are in violation of sanctions, thinking that I'll be able to get out of this because I'm big enough, or I'll be used as a bargaining chip for somewhere else, and that sort of erodes the rule of law, general approach that the United States has had historically. So I think that's the one big concern. The second is that this really, I think, has probably motivated China to further pursue the Made in China 2025 strategy, which, whether they're going to do it as publicly or not, this recognition that ZTE was so reliant on American supply chains and parts and components and technology that essentially having export controls or an export ban from the United States in place meant that could essentially cripple the company, and that's 70,000 workers, right? That just, I think, made the Chinese government recognize how reliant they were on semiconductors and a lot of this technology and say, you know what, we can't be that reliant on the Americans and on the West. We need to do more of this stuff ourselves. And that is, again, another one of these areas that's completely, at least rhetorically, at odds with the position the Trump administration is taking.
It's funny because the moral hazard thing works both ways, right? On the one hand, I'm sure the Xi government was like really pissed off at ZTE for doing something so stupid. I mean, risking their entire business for like God knows how many cell phones they were selling in Iran. Because the ZTE, the company themselves knew how reliant they were on U.S. things, and they understood the risk they were facing. So, on the one hand, yeah, you can see this as a way you can see this as like, oh, sure, it's like a Sputnik moment. But on the other hand, I can imagine if I'm an executive in a Chinese company that I can expect the government to go to bat for me, even if 5-10 years from now I'm still reliant and something else like this comes up.
Yeah, I just think that this was such new presidential authority and behavior weighing in an area that hadn't traditionally been the case, that it did open up a whole can of worms, that it didn't seem as though had been fully thought through, what the consequences of that would be over the long term and how it might actually undermine some of their other really kind of important interests.
So staying with U.S. weaknesses for a second, Gary Huffbauer, your colleague, recently wrote a piece comparing letting tariffs rise on foodstuff during a trade war as being akin to invading Russia in the wintertime. Presidents keeping letting this happen but never really learning. The examples being Carter with the Soviet Union after the Afghanistan invasion, and then Ronald Reagan with the Japan tit for tat trade disputes. But I wonder actually to what extent Trump really cares about this sort of thing. Given that it's hard enough to embarrass him post something like Charlottesville, I wonder what sort of outside pressure would really get him to change his mind on something that he seems to have, one of the few policy areas that he seems to have had constant views on since back in the 1980s.
So that's another really good question. And so I think, to frame it, what we've seen happen is China very effectively, when they've been caught up in President Trump's tariffs, have retaliated against American farm products, soybeans, sorghum, pork. President Trump politically, about a month or so ago, decided that he was going to try to pay off American farmers. So he offered them about $12 billion in subsidies, hoping that would, quiet at least some of their political wrath in the lead up to the 2018 midterm elections. We'll see if it works or not. To be fair, when you talk to farmers, despite the fact that they're recognizing that they're being hurt by these policies, that the pushback, the retaliation that not just China but that other countries are doing as well is hurting them, they haven't yet turned on President Trump politically. They seem to, think that he is going to get a deal out of all of this. Now, obviously, for a lot of that part of America, it's more than just their economic interests in trade. They may be more aligned with President Trump on his, Supreme Court selections, say, and other economic policy choices. So it's not just farming. But I think the broader point that my colleague, that Gary Huffbauer, was making is spot on. The other really nice example and parallel from history that I think is telling was this 1971 episode when the United States essentially had a boycott on exports of soybeans. Essentially, soybean prices had risen and there was a shortage in the United States, and so they stopped American farmers from being able to export them. And at that moment in time, it was Japan that was heavily reliant on American soybeans. And so Japan obviously became very, very worried, and their economic response to that was to invest heavily in soybean production in Brazil. And so today, the two major soybean producers in the world are the United States and Brazil. And if the United States farmers lose the Chinese market because of these tariffs, Brazil is going to be there to replace them. Well, that Brazil soybean is largely responsible and exists because of poorly thought out American policies from the early 1970s. So this is just an example of a way that, unfortunately, trade policy, when misused, can actually come back to bite you.
Well, God bless the Chinese biochemists who I know are out there working on growing the six-legged pig. Because one of the exports that the U.S. Sends a lot to China is the is foot hooves, which aren't necessarily all that desirable in Western cuisine, but definitely you see on almost every menu here in Beijing. So let's now turn to the operational fronts as the case may be. So you mentioned earlier a few of the laws that Trump is creatively using. And maybe we don't have to go into detail into too much, but I'm curious if there really is all that much limit. I mean, on the one hand, the U.S. is a member of WTO, and then there are certain restrictions, and you're supposed to go through a process before you can put on countervailing duties. But it seems like anything can be a national security threat. So is there anything way in which someone could challenge these uses of the law in the courts, or is it basically at the end of the day the president's prerogative?
So there's a number of different ways in which there could be challenges. Whether any of them will ultimately be effective, I think, is unclear. And again, this is my colleague Gary Huffbauer was one of the very first people to write about this, and it was even prior to the election, back during the campaign, when President Trump was threatening to do what he's actually turned out to do in terms of invoking these national security laws, the Section 301 law. Gary's a lawyer. I'm not. So, this is with a note of caution. Gary's view is that there could be challenges, but there really isn't precedent out there to take this power away from the government through the courts. And the courts are likely to say, Congress has given the president the authority to determine what's in the United States' national security or not, and thus, he can exercise it. And so in Gary's view, I think the American courts are unlikely to be very useful to reining this in. There have been some mutterings in Congress about potentially reining in the president's authority, and that may be ultimately what it takes, is putting a little bit more discipline on when it is the president can simply raise tariffs because some product he or she thinks threatened American national security. There have been calls to do that, various proposed amendments to different bills. Not many of those have seemed to get much traction thus far. But what we are, I was going to say, but the other thing that we are seeing happening is obviously the retaliation. And so the economic costs of these policies are already, I think, beginning to materialize, and that is going to create some pushback. And more of that may be on the horizon. Countries are challenging the United States in the WTO's court system. Now, historically, what normally in normal eras, what would have happened is those cases would have had to be resolved first before you would see the retaliation show up. But that's not the case here. President Trump is facing retaliation for his tariffs on steel and aluminum and on China, even without countries seeking to go through the WTO's court system.
So this you gave me a nice transition, leading into your main criticism of the sort of tactical execution of Trump's trade war so far. So in recent congressional testimony that you gave, you focused a lot on prioritization of action at the WTO level, potentially reviving the ghosts of TPP and TTIP. I'm curious if you could sort of elaborate on, saying if you wanted to take a more aggressive policy from the one that the Obama administration followed, how exactly you would organize things on the ground.
So I think I would motivate it, first of all, by recognizing that at the heart of a number of the trade issues that seem to be behind what President Trump is doing, there is something there. There's a there. And so if you look at the steel and aluminum tariffs, if you look at the tariffs that were done on solar panels back in January, The concern there is this issue with China. And China, whether it's excess capacity, industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, it's the fact that it's just a very different economic system. Now, where I question the Trump administration's tactical approach is, to my mind, this is a challenge, the Chinese system, that doesn't just confront the United States, but it confronts the European Union, Japan, Canada, all of the market-oriented economies out there in the world. And so what you would naturally then do is to say to all of these other countries, hey, you're all in this same boat. Your companies are finding it difficult to produce. Your steel companies are suffering because of this overcapacity. Your aluminum companies, your solar panel producers can't do this either. So we should work together. Bring perhaps disputes against China to the WTO, to the World Trade Organization, see what could happen there. If the existing rule book isn't enough, write new rules in the World Trade Organization and deal with it there. Thus far, over the first 2 years, that's not been the Trump administration's approach. Thus far, they've done exactly the opposite, where they've said to our allies, these market-oriented allies in the least, we're going to hit you with tariffs. We're going to impose tariffs on your steel and aluminum. We're going to threaten to impose tariffs on your automobiles. And so these countries are now in a position where they're finding that it's difficult and challenging to cooperate with the Trump administration and actually confront China on these issues. Now, that being said, we may be starting to see some whispers of this potentially changing. There have been some statements coming out of especially the European Union, but also Japan, of potential ways to reform the WTO. There doesn't seem to have been a whole lot of American leadership in this area yet, but there have been behind the scenes on 3 different occasions. There have been joint statements issued by the Trump administration and the trade ministers for the European Union and Japan over this common concern of China. And so perhaps there may be some ability of these 3 countries in particular to show some leadership. That would have seemed to be the natural way of actually eventually confronting China. And maybe, it's going to take the Trump administration some time, I guess, to eventually get there. We're now 2 years into this administration. But that's, I think, that how one would naturally kind of confront this, not try to go at the China question, the China issue, the China problem that the United States faces alone, because it's really not the United States alone in terms of feeling the effects of the challenge from China.
So let me give you the Robert Lighthizer retort and see how you respond. So the natural way, maybe natural according to an academic sitting in the Peterson Institute, but not one who wants to see some real action. So write new rules. I mean, how long has the Doha round been going on now? It seems like that method has been exhausted. If you want to bring complaints at the WTO, that may take until the second term to be able to do any tariffs. So the only real tools we have available are these, trade laws from 1974, and just look at all the success we've had. China lowering tariffs on certain goods, promising to open financial markets at a more accelerated pace. This unorthodox style of confrontation has actually been able to get some results.
So my pushback against that would be on the financial markets stuff. A lot of that was being negotiated and was essentially, almost done by the end of the Obama administration. So that's kind of doing something that China has really wanted to do itself for a long period of time. The lowering of tariffs, I think, is actually an interesting point. So, a really important thing that seems to have taken place is China has actually agreed to lower its tariffs on imports of automobiles. But because of the strategy that the United States has used in this area, it's actually worked to harm the United States. So right now in China, a tremendous number of cars are built by American companies. GM is the biggest example. When China agreed to lower its tariffs on cars, it didn't do so only toward the United States. It lowered its tariffs toward everybody. So this benefits not just, or potentially benefits, not just cars manufactured in the United States, but also in Japan, South Korea, and Europe. If you're the United States, that's a huge task. That was a huge gift that you just handed to the Europeans, the Japanese, and South Koreans. Why wouldn't you have them on your side and be asking for something from them for doing that on their behalf? But it's even worse because when China has retaliated against the $50 billion of tariffs the Trump administration has imposed so far, they retaliated by raising the tariffs on automobiles back again toward the United States. Now they're now lower toward everybody else in the world based on the work that the administration had done, but not toward the United States. They're back up at levels of maybe even 40%. So the strategy, it's generated some movement, but not really any movement, it turns out, that's benefiting American interests.
And can you walk through the potential damage that you may see happening to the WTO system by sort of going around what the U.S. has been advocating for a long time? Yeah.
So I think to your broader question of the WTO system, the Doha round, nothing much had been happening. I don't disagree with that, and I think it was even clear under the Obama administration that countries like China, as well as India and South Africa and others, had really held up the agenda of being able to push forward on any new rules and disciplines that you would want to have. But the reaction, at least of the earlier administrations at the end of the Bush administration and the Obama administration as well, was to say, okay, that we're going to have an alternative. And the alternative first was the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So, let's negotiate new rules covering not only the NAFTA countries of Canada and Mexico, but a lot of countries around the Asia and Pacific with Japan, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand. We'll write the new rules that we want. We'll do a similar thing with Europe through the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And what these new agreements are going to have, if you look at them closely enough, there's actually going to be elements of these agreements that are the things that we're most worried about with China. So we're going to write chapters in trade geek speak. That's what these things are called. The parts of the agreement to deal with state-owned enterprises. Now, the TPP, you've got Vietnam, but that's, and they have state-owned enterprises. But really, that was an agreement that was written in a way to say, China, these are the big concerns that we have with you. State-owned enterprises, labor, environment, competition policy. You're going to want to be in this agreement, the TPP agreement, at some point. It may not be today, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now. In order for you to be there, in order for you to get in, to accede to this agreement, and there was an accession clause, this is the kind of change that you're going to need to make. This is the kind of thing that you're going to need to be willing to sign up for. So there definitely was a strategy, a rules-oriented strategy to try to deal with China, to try to address China over the long run that wasn't necessarily happening within the WTO. I think there might have been the idea that, well, over the long run, perhaps we'll be able to introduce these disciplines multilaterally. But there definitely was a strategy there by earlier administrations.
I would not be surprised. So generally, the trend is with presidential elections, in primaries and in campaigns, for the past 20 odd years, presidents have been campaigning against China and against China trade. I think there was even some leak where the Obama, it came out that the Obama administration was actually telling the Chinese this during one of the campaigns to sort of not be worried about it. And come inauguration day, the policy then changes towards more, looking towards more economic engagement and accommodation. It would be very funny, and I would not be too surprised if, say, by year 6 of a second term of a Trump administration, we come back to these same ideas, and Trump thinks that a U.S.-China bit, a bilateral investment treaty, is actually like an awesome deal that he can sell to the American people, and something like a TPP, he can change a few words and say, look how great look how great this agreement is. So even though TTIP and TPP have had a rough few months for sure, they're definitely not. The ideas are not going away permanently, it seems.
I think they're not permanently going away for those folks who are trade watchers and who are interested in global governance and setting up rules of engagement and rules of cooperation in the system. I agree with that entirely. And while I also agree with your general point that typically in election season, politicians behave on the campaign trail very differently when it comes to trade and trade policy than they do once they come into office. The exception is President Trump. Since he's been in office, there's absolutely zero evidence to suggest that he is actually in favor of free trade, international agreements, cooperation. All he has done has been to threaten to impose tariffs and then followed through in imposing those tariffs. There haven't been any removal of any of the tariffs that he's imposed thus far. He hasn't gotten any other countries to take any tariffs off that they've imposed, and countries have imposed a lot of tariffs against the United States. There have been no agreements with any other country. Even this vaunted deal that he got with South Korea essentially was a trade restricting deal. It allowed the United States to keep tariffs on trucks that might be imported from Korea 25 years from now, keep those tariffs on for 40 years or something like this. So President Trump, there's no evidence to support the idea that you've proposed. Now, with President Trump, he can always change his mind in a heartbeat. But when it comes to trade, we just have never seen any evidence to actually support the idea being followed through, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one real claim I had, because it is true that the trade, the just like allergy towards trade is something that really you can see throughout the history of him and the administration. But the allure of the deal, I think, is another one of these things which is sort of a constant in Trump's foreign policy and personality. And maybe there may come a time where with all other sort of deals falling apart, this is a place where he feels like he can like come to the table and do something exciting and creative. So I don't know. It's definitely a long shot bet on my end, but I still wouldn't entirely rule it out.
No, I think it's possible, but I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind with President Trump in deals is he can spin something as a deal that actually isn't better than what we have currently. And this is, the thing to watch here is what's going on with the NAFTA negotiations. It's possible that he may come to some deal with Mexico and potentially Canada that he can claim as a trade deal, but it's not a trade liberalizing deal. It's not a agreement that improves upon the set of rules that were already there and pushes us forward, but instead that actually takes us backward from where we had been. Yes, he will claim that as a deal, but I don't think people that are truly engaged in the international economic policy area, it would be the kind of deal that any of them would have been looking forward to, or that certainly would be happy to have concluded.
Yeah, so deals, but not necessarily towards liberalization, but maybe giving a legitimizing sheen to the sort of trade barriers which he's looking to institute is what you're getting at.
Yeah, I think that's a strong possibility of what we might see. So I think it took China a while to understand, I think, the Trump administration was potentially serious about imposing all of these tariffs. So if we think back to the initial Trump-Xi, Mar-a-Lago summit of April 2017, the real sense then was, we understand how this guy operates. He just wants a deal. We'll give them some things, and we've got this figured out. And I think it's become clearer to them that they don't. That it may just be the case with this president that he likes tariffs, and that may be for, again, one of two reasons that we're not sure about. It could be for there's this grand strategy involved that he really does, that there really is a plan to potentially remake the trading system, or it may just be that he likes tariffs and wants to impose tariffs. I think what China's confronting right now in their response is, okay, we're going to retaliate with our own tariffs. We'll first hit back primarily in politically sensitive areas, agriculture, where it is that we can. They're now moving to a lot of other products as well. This, $60 billion list that they released last week, they've essentially exhausted the agriculture for the most part from the United States and can no longer retaliate over that. And so they're moving into a lot of other products. But I think being more strategic, there's a range of tariffs they're imposing. Some of them are as low as 5%. They're recognizing, as they should, that anytime you impose a tariff, you're actually hurting yourself. And China has recognized that, yeah, we do want to impose, some costs on the Americans, so they recognize, the implications and costs of President Trump's actions. But we do want to minimize the damage to ourselves, and, tariffs are costly. The Chinese consumers are now not going to get access to these soybeans, to these great pig hooves that are, the part of their food supply. So they're minimizing a bit of that by imposing smaller tariffs, some as small as 5% as retaliation. But I think the bigger question that they're facing is what to do. And they're really struggling. They, I believe, said publicly that within the Trump administration, it's not clear who the point person on this should be. We've seen kind of a rotating cast of characters that have seemed to want to lead the dialogue with China, but to no great effect. And on the Chinese side, it's not clear who's holding, the pen for President Trump and going to be ultimately able to take, credible offers that they might be able to make, speak for the president in a negotiating setting in ways that are, traditionally done. And until that happens, until it's clear on the American side who actually has the authority to negotiate, I see the Chinese government is just feeling as though they're potentially being embarrassed by this whole thing, and thus, increasingly unlikely to seriously engage. So there is a sense in which this could get worse, before it ultimately before it would get better.
I'm curious if you could walk us through the currency dynamic here. I mean, China has repeatedly said that they're not using currency depreciation as a tool, particularly in response to the trade war. But say they would. How would you? I mean, because there has been a pretty significant devaluation over the past month or two. How do you evaluate that as a tool, and does it make sense for an economy to sort of print money as a way to, buy back currency floating around as a way to support exports in a context of rising tariffs?
Yeah. So I think there's a big distinction that needs to be made about the Chinese government behavior with respect to currency of 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even up to maybe 5 years ago in currency manipulation and keeping it undervalued as a deliberate policy target relative to the just pure economic incentives that are at work today in moving markets. And when you impose tariffs like the United States has done or is threatening to do, that can have the exact effect on the Chinese currency that we've seen take place, a depreciation. And which can essentially offset much of what President Trump thinks he can achieve by imposing higher tariffs. If the currency depreciates by essentially that same amount, then the cost advantage that would have been there, but because of the tariff has basically been eliminated without necessarily having any policy intervention on the Chinese side.
So, final question for you. Presumably, you don't have any PhD candidates under you right now at the Peterson Institute. But now in these heady times, I'm curious, what dissertation topics you would be throwing out there for eager political economy and PhD students who want to take a more academic lens to what's going on right now.
So what I would say is I would actually make two recommendations. And I think one of the challenges that we face in the United States right now is the result of this problem is we've had, I think both in economics, but I think also in political science as well, increasingly research that has become less and less tied to reality, less and less tied to current institutions, policies, laws. So what I would recommend is to reverse that, to focus on the data, the policies that we're actually seeing governments implement and utilize today, the laws that are out there that are being used. Yes, we need to keep utilizing, especially in economics, but also increasingly in political science, models seriously, estimation techniques, research design questions seriously. But we also need to treat institutions, I think, more seriously than we have over the last 15 or 20 years, where the disciplines have increasingly moved away from that. So what I would say, and again, I think also interdisciplinarity is increasingly, or multidisciplinarity. I find now, despite the fact that I'm a PhD economist, I spend much of my time talking to lawyers and legal scholars and political scientists and learning from them as I do other economists. So I think in the research world in which we're heading, it's increasingly important to recognize the overlap that we have with each other and how much we actually need to focus on, reality and what it is that's happening today if we want to contribute.
Chad, thanks so much for coming on China Econ Talk.
Thanks again for having me.
写 bug， 你爱的那个 bad boy 都想与我有瓜葛，多少 hate 他们把我视为眼中